From the Forbidden Case Files of Old New England, The Shadow Farm, Chapter 2. Lance Hughes, private detective and reluctant archivist of the strange, found himself in the back room of a dingy pawn shop in Arkham, Massachusetts. The revolver he had pawned now lay in the greasy hands of the shopkeeper, a necessary sacrifice to afford the train ticket that would carry him to Indianapolis, Indiana, a journey he felt compelled to undertake, despite the gnawing sense of dread that had taken root in his soul. As the train rumbled through the night, Lance dozed fitfully in his seat, the rhythmic clattering of the wheels failing to lull him into peaceful slumber. Instead, his mind was consumed by dark dreams. He saw a desolate farm, its fields overgrown with twisted, thorny weeds, and the barn shrouded in shadows that writhed and undulated like living things. From the dark woods surrounding the property, twisted, misshapen figures emerged, barely human, their forms lost in the darkness, yet unmistakably malevolent. They moved with a sinister purpose, converging on the barn, where a single, feeble light flickered dimly. Lance felt their gaze upon him, though he couldn't see their eyes. They whispered in a language older than time, their voices seeping into his mind like poison, and the weight of their presence pressed down on his chest until he awoke with a start. The train was pulling into Union Station in Indianapolis, the first rays of a sickly dawn casting a wan light through the soot-streaked windows. Lance rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the lingering dread of the nightmare. He gathered his belongings, a worn suitcase and Frank's report on the Hendrickson farm, and made his way off the train. The city was awakening around him, the streets beginning to fill with the bustle of early morning activity. Lance hailed a taxi, giving the driver Frank's office address. As they drove through the city, Lance couldn't help but marvel at how well Frank seemed to be doing for himself. The bustling downtown was a stark contrast to the sleepy, haunted streets of Arkham. The taxi weaved through the traffic, eventually pulling up to a building near Monument Circle. The morning sun glinted off the monument's bronze statues, but the sight offered Lance little comfort. Frank's office was on the first floor of a well-kept brick building, the glass door proudly displaying the name Frank Staples, Private Investigator, in gold leaf. Lance couldn't help but feel a pang of envy. His own office back in Arkham was marked by nothing more than a scrap of paper stuck to the door with a wad of old chewing gum, a far cry from the professional setup Frank had. He tried the door, but it was locked. A sense of unease crept over him. Frank was usually early to the office, meticulous about his work. Lance frowned and circled the building until he found a side window. The latch was loose, and with some effort, Lance pried it open. The window led into a cramped bathroom, barely big enough for one person. Lance squeezed his frame through the opening, his shoes landing with a soft thud on the tiled floor. As he pushed open the bathroom door and stepped into the office, his heart sank. The place was a wreck. File cabinets had been overturned, their contents strewn across the floor. Frank's desk was a mess, papers scattered everywhere, drawers pulled out and upended. Someone had been here and they had been searching for something they were desperate to find. Lance's eyes were drawn to the coat rack near the door. Frank's old raincoat hung there, looking as grungy as ever. Lance remembered how Frank considered it his lucky charm, refusing to part with it even after it had been riddled with bullet holes during a run-in with a mobster. Frank had always said the coat had saved his life that day. The fact that it was still here, hanging on the rack, set off alarm bells in Lance's mind. Frank never went anywhere without that coat. Lance approached the coat and lifted it from the rack. It felt heavier than it should, and when he reached into the pockets, he found the reason why: a camera, an old boxy model with a pack of flashbulbs wrapped in paper. The strap of the camera had been looped around the hanger, as if Frank had tied it there in a hurry. Lance carefully removed the camera, noting that the film was still inside. It looked like 4 photographs had been taken, but the film hadn't been developed yet. Lance knew this was a clue, perhaps the only one he had. Frank wouldn't have left this behind unless it was important, but whatever Frank had photographed, it had been significant enough for someone to tear his office apart looking for it. Lance tucked the camera and bulbs into his suitcase, casting one last glance around the trashed office, before slipping out the way he had come. The city was fully awake now, the streets bustling with people on their way to work. But Lance felt a chill in the air, a sense of foreboding that clung to him like a shadow. His first task was to find someone who could develop the film. Lance found an advertisement of a small photography shop on the outskirts of town that might be able to help. It was a dingy place, the kind that catered to amateur photographers and curious types who didn't mind a bit of discretion. The shopkeeper, a middle-aged man with thick glasses, took the film without question, promising to have it developed within the hour. Lance paced the cramped shop, the minutes dragging by with agonizing slowness. His mind raced with possibilities, each more horrifying than the last. What had Frank seen? What had he captured on film that was worth ransacking an office over? When the shopkeeper finally emerged from the darkroom, his face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he handed the envelope of developed photos to Lance. 3 of them were ruined, the shopkeeper said, his voice shaking. But the last one, well, you'll see. Lance took the envelope, his heart pounding. He stepped outside into the alley beside the shop, needing to be alone to see what Frank had captured. With trembling fingers, he slid the single photograph from the envelope. The image was grainy, the light from the flashbulb harsh against the darkness. It showed the Hendrickson farm, just as Lance had seen it in his nightmare. The ramshackle barn, the twisted trees, the fields overgrown with weeds. But there, in the center of the photograph, something moved in the shadows. It was difficult to make out at first, just a blur of darkness against the night. But as Lance stared, the shape became clearer. Too clear. It was a figure, tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long and crooked. Its face was nothing more than a void, a black emptiness where eyes, nose and mouth should have been. It stood at the edge of the barn's doorway, as if guarding it, or perhaps beckoning something inside. But the worst part was the feeling that came with it, a sense of dread so profound that Lance felt his knees weaken. The figure in the photograph wasn't just standing there. It was aware of him, watching him through the lens of the camera, through the very paper of the photograph. Lance felt as though it could see him even now across time and space. Lance's hands shook as he shoved the photograph back into the envelope. His friend was missing, taken by something that wasn't of this world. And now, Lance knew, he was on a collision course with the same malevolent force. There was no turning back. Whatever was happening out at the Hendrickson farm, it was drawing him in, pulling him into a web of darkness and madness. Lance only hoped he could find Frank before it was too late. As he hailed a cab to take him as close to Liston, Indiana as he could afford, Lance's mind was already racing ahead, planning his next move. He had to get to Liston, to the farm, to the source of all this terror. The shadows were calling him, and he knew he had no choice but to answer. The cab pulled away from the curb, the city of Indianapolis fading behind him. Lance's grip tightened on the envelope, the weight of the unknown pressing heavily on his shoulders. And in the distance, far beyond the reach of the city's lights, something waited for him on a primordial patch of ground, something born in the absence of light and nurtured by man's dark desires. End Chapter 2, continued in Chapter 3 of The Shadow Farm.